Hello Year 9 and 10, I hope you've all been keeping well. We're going to begin this term by focusing on poetry revision as both year groups have studied this. We're going to look at Exposure by Wilfred Owen today. What I'd like you to do for your do now is to look at the 3 words on the slide and provide your own definitions for these words. I would like you to pause the video now and define each of these words. Okay, let's start with propaganda. Propaganda is information which is biased, so one-sided information, which is used to encourage people to do something or encourage them to have a particular point of view. It's normally political. If you look at the picture provided, this is a very typical example of propaganda from the First World War. It features Lord Kitchener, and he's there to encourage young men to enlist in the army. The second word, hypothermia, is a dangerous condition when someone's body temperature becomes too low. In severe cases, this can lead to death. This is not to be confused with hyperthermia, spelt with P-E-R, which is when someone's body temperature becomes too high. And finally, exposure. This has several connotations, but essentially it's to be vulnerable to something or to have no protection from something harmful. For those of you who attempted the STAR challenge, there are several connotations to the word exposure, but essentially for our poem, you can think of exposure to bullets, soldiers dying of exposure, so dying of hypothermia, and also this can be Owen exposing the harsh realities of war, or essentially an anti-propaganda poem. Let's look at our learning outcomes. Today you will be revising the first half of Exposure. We have 15 poems in our Power and Conflict cluster, and they encompass a very wide variety of themes. Exposure is a fabulous poem for you to revise because it covers a lot of the themes that come up in the other poems. So when it comes to your exam, where you are given one poem and you have to compare it by memory to another, this is a good one as it can be used in so many of them. Some of the themes it covers are war and conflict, patriotism, identity, so you have soldiers questioning their purpose and their daily struggles, feelings of isolation by the rest of society, but also the camaraderie of soldiers. There's anger, desperation, inner conflict, death, and ultimately the biggest theme within this as well is the power of nature. I can't express how good this poem is in terms of one for revision. It truly is a fantastic one for you to revise as you can link it to so many other poems. So today we'll be looking at the first 4 stanzas. You'll be answering comprehension questions on these, and then you'll write a couple of piece paragraphs. Okay, look at this question. What do you know about Wilfred Owen? I want you to pause this video in a minute and write a minimum of 3 facts that you can remember about him. If there's truly nothing that you remember, have a look at the pictures and see what you can guess about his life. Okay, pause the video now. This will serve as really good contextual information for the zoom out section of your piece paragraphs. I'm going to read the slide to you and I would like you to add a further 3 bits of information to your work. So Wilfred Owen was a famous World War I soldier and poet. His poems paint a realistic picture of what life was like for soldiers in the trenches and present the reality of the conditions and everyday experiences of war. Owen was 22 years old when he enlisted in the British Army. In 1917, after experiencing heavy fighting, he returned to England where he was diagnosed with shell shock at Craiglockhart Hospital. Shell shock is what we now refer to as PTSD or post-traumatic stress disorder, and Craiglockhart Hospital was specifically for soldiers who were suffering from PTSD or shell shock. Owen was severely traumatised by his experiences of warfare, which included being trapped for days next to the dead body of a fellow officer. So you can really see why these sorts of experiences would have had an impact on his mental health. Owen returned to the front line in July 1918, not 2018 as the slide says. He died on the 4th of November, exactly 1 week before Armistice Day. Very tragically, his mother received a telegram informing her of his death on Armistice Day, so on the 11th of November 1918, as the church bells in his hometown of Shrewsbury were ringing out in celebration, signalling the end of the war. In total, Owen spent 3 years in the army, and unfortunately he died just 1 week before the end. I now want you to brain dump everything you know about the poem Exposure. I want you to do at least 3 details, but more would be preferable, and if you can include some quotations, that would be amazing too. Pause the video now. I would like you to add to your notes now. Exposure serves as an anti-propaganda poem. Wilfred Owen shows the reality of soldiers who died from hypothermia, exposed to the horrific conditions of open trench warfare before dawn. As we considered in our Do Now, the title is significant as the soldiers are exposed to the German enemy beyond no man's land. They are exposed to the elements, which in the poem can be considered more lethal than the humans. And also Owen is exposing the harsh realities of war. It is made up of 8 stanzas, which are 5 lines each. These are known as quintains. The lines are uneven in length and have no regular rhyme scheme, which could reflect the unpredictability of war. It is important that you take down these structural notes, as writing about structure will get you a higher grade in your exam. We are now going to do vocabulary ping pong. It's going to be a little bit different as you're not in the room with me to repeat the words after me. What I would like you to do is just write down the words that you do not know and write down the definitions next to them. So our first word is merciless. Merciless is a cruel and cold-hearted attack. Word 2 is salient. So salient is a bulge in the battlefield which goes into enemy territory. Sentries are soldiers stationed to keep guard. Poignant makes you feel sad and or regretful. Melancholy is feeling sad. I'd now like you to choose one of the words you've learnt today and explode it in the mind map. Make sure you pause this now. Now it's time for our poem. I'm going to read the stanzas to you and then I would like you to pause the video so that you can attempt the questions. You must note that I've added the line numbers to the poem and you won't have these line numbers in your exam, but this is just for clarification for your comprehension questions. Exposure. Our brains ache in the merciless iced east winds that knife us. Wearied, we keep awake because the night is silent. Low drooping flares confuse our memory of the salient. Worried by silence, sentries whisper, curious, nervous. But nothing happens. Okay, pause the video now. I would like you to note that these are my interpretations of the questions given. Your answers might be slightly different, and that doesn't make your answers wrong. It just means that we've interpreted it differently, and that's part of the beauty of literature. Just make sure that whatever you write, you can back up with a quotation and that your explanation is very clear. The significance of beginning with the pronoun are shows collective suffering and despair. So it shows all the soldiers are together, unified in this experience with their comrades. The opening is abrupt. It's like it's in the middle of an experience and it gives a sense of immediacy. You could link this to Bayonet Charge, which also starts in the middle of the action. It starts with the line, "Suddenly he awoke and was running," and both poems are about World War I, so this is a really good link there. For number 2, the first line in the poem is very significant because it is full of devices. We have sensory description in terms of brain's ache. There's personification, so you've got the merciless iced east winds and the use of the verb knife. And there's also the sibilance there, so that repetition of the S sound, merciless, iced, east, winds, and us. For number 3, it says to explain the effect of just one of the devices, but I'm going to go through all 3 for those of you who've tried them. Initially, there's sensory description. So the brain's ache makes it seem more real and raw. It could refer to the cold. It could refer to soldiers getting a headache, to some sort of head injury, and it could also allude to shell shock. It is effective because the pain becomes really apparent to the reader. The sibilance there is the sound of the biting wind. So the repetition of the S can reflect the sound of that wind. As for the personification, the wind being merciless and knifing the soldiers makes it seem malicious and like it's doing it with intent. So it ultimately makes it seem a lot scarier. In number 4, in line 3, we've got a sense of danger created in a few ways. We have the low drooping flares, which in of themselves are very dangerous as they could hit somebody. It could cause severe injury through either burning or just viciously being hit by it. Amongst other uses, flares are sent out as distress signals, so that in of itself heightens the sense of danger. Also, the soldiers are confusing their memory of the salient. So if we remember, the salient is that bulge, it's that part of their territory that sticks into the enemy's territory. So for them to be confused by their memory of where the salient is, they could just as easily be in the enemy's territory and not realise. So that shows that sense of danger there as well. Finally, to be confused in the trenches would in of itself be very dangerous, as they could be confused for all manner of things, for instance, from tiredness, from lack of nutrition, just by being in the dark, the dazzling of the flares. But just one little slip up from this confusion could ultimately result in their death. Number 5. The punctuation mark at the end of lines 1, 2 and 3 is known as an ellipsis. It has several uses, but within this poem I like to see it as it emphasising how long all this had been dragging on for. If you think about it, the war had been going on for 4 years. Many soldiers spent several months at a time in the trenches, and it didn't seem like there was an end in sight. Number 6 could be a little bit challenging. The type of rhyme used in this poem is known as a half rhyme. So if you think about it, the words naivus and nervous, silent and salient don't rhyme properly. We call these half rhymes. The effect of this is it has an unsettling effect on the reader. So this also reflects the trauma that they're going through in war. And finally, number 7, the device used is sibilance again. So we've got worried by silence, centuries, whisper, curious, nervous. You can really hear that repetition of the S sound. As an aside, you need to think of sibilance as slightly different to alliteration. So alliteration, we have our repeated letters or sounds at the beginning of words. With sibilance, it can come at the beginning, middle or end. This time we can think about the sibilance as reflecting the sound of the wind, as we did earlier, or it could also be reflecting the whispering soldiers. So the word silence there links back to the word silent in line 2, and the repetition of this reinforces the effects of the silence within the trenches. It is a tense silence as opposed to a comforting one. And furthermore, just a little bit more on sibilance. It is specifically in relation to the S sound, although it can be used for C, sh, ch, or Z, although predominantly we see it as a repetition of the S sound. Stanza 2. Watching, we hear the mad gust tugging on the wire, like twitching agonies of men among its brambles. Northward incessantly the flickering gunnery rumbles, far off like a dull rumour of some other war. What are we doing here? Okay, I'd like you to pause the video now and attempt the questions below. Okay, number 7. There are a couple of devices in line 6. We have sensory description in terms of synesthesia. Now, for those of you who haven't heard of this, it is where you swap senses. So where we've got watching, we hear, this is the senses being swapped. This is one of these higher level devices which will really help you to get a better grade in your exam. So ultimately with synesthesia, it creates a sense of confusion, and this definitely reflects the confusion that the soldiers would be feeling in the trenches. We've also got personification. So by personifying the wind as mad, Owen is showing how unpredictable and scary the weather is and the complete lack of control that the soldiers have against this extremely powerful enemy. Number 8. The device in line 7 is a simile, and the effect of it is the agony of the men is reflected in the wind. We've got this really powerful imagery of men struggling with brambles, and it makes the reader think of the imagery of violence and pain associated with getting injured in warfare. Number 9. The flickering gunnery rumbles reminds the soldiers of their other enemy, the human enemy. They can hear guns off in the distance. Number 10. The line, like a dull rumour of some other war, is very significant because the soldiers are so tired and jaded from the war that they feel detached from it. The sound of the guns in the background doesn't seem nearly as vicious as the war against the weather that they are fighting. Finally, line 10 is very significant. The rhetorical question, what are we doing here, shows that they have lost faith in the war. They've lost faith in the people leading them and their purpose. It highlights the soldiers' despair at the futility of it all. So by futility, as in the pointlessness of it all. Stanza 3. The poignant misery of dawn begins to grow. We only know war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. Dawn massing in the east her melancholy army, attacks once more in ranks on shivering ranks of grey, but nothing happens. I'd like you to pause the video now and attempt the questions below. Number 12. The rule of 3 in line 12 is war lasts, rain soaks, and clouds sag stormy. We know that this line creates a sense of discomfort. The war last bit refers to the fact that the war had been going on for 3 years by this point. He wrote this in 1917, so just a year before the end of the war. So he really at this point must have felt like there was no let up. And in terms of the rain soaking and cloud sag stormy, well, we know that the soldiers in World War I spent a lot of time in uncomfortable, non-weatherproof uniform. Very famously, a lot of them suffered from trench foot. So the rain soaking represents them, the rain soaking into their clothes. However, the clouds sagging stormy shows that the clouds are heavy and ready with another downpour. So they know that more is coming and that there is no let up in their discomfort. Number 13. The device is personification. We've got Dawn being made to seem like an army general gathering her army of rain and hail. It's important to note that the German soldiers also wore grey and tended to attack from the east. The irony here is that dawn is normally associated with new life and hope, but it is not in this case. Number 14. Hopefully you've noticed that the final line in this stanza was repeated in the first stanza, and it gets repeated again a few more times throughout the poem. It is known as a refrain. When you repeat a line in poetry, that's known as a refrain. It reflects Owen's belief that war is futile. So war involved a lot of waiting around, and during these periods of inactivity, general morale, so how the soldiers were feeling, became very low. So it could represent the boredom of waiting for action that the soldiers experienced in these very long, drawn-out battles. Trench warfare generally involved a lot of doing nothing, which was interspersed with some very vicious attacks. So obviously this didn't serve very well for their mental health either. Therefore, Owen is repeating this phrase, but nothing happens, at the end of each stanza, just to show that sense of boredom and futility. Finally, number 15, you need to find a lexical set for sadness. Now remember, with a lexical set, you're just finding words that have something in common. They're often linked by a theme. So in this particular instance, we're looking for any words that link to sadness. You may have some that are slightly different to mine, but the words I found from this stanza are poignant, misery, war, rain, clouds, sag, melancholy, grey, and nothing. All of these words put together really helps to create a bleak atmosphere. Stanza 4. Sudden successive flights of bullets streak the silence, less deadly than the air that shudders black with snow. With sidelong flowing flakes that flock, pause and renew. We watch them wandering up and down the wind's nonchalance, but nothing happens. Pause the video here and attempt the questions below. Number 16. The device once more is sibilance. We have our repetition of the S sound, sudden successive flights, bullets, streak and silence. This time you could argue that it reflects the sound of the bullets. Number 17. 3 examples of personification in this stanza are the air that shudders, flakes that flock and pause, and wind's nonchalance. Incidentally, having flakes that flock could also be seen as zoomorphism because it could be linked to animals in terms of birds tending to flock. And finally, number 18, personification is a really effective device in this poem as it makes the actions of nature seem deliberate and calculated, and therefore it makes the whole atmosphere a lot more tense and more scary. So it's like an enemy with intent to cause harm, but one which they really cannot fight. Finally, for those of you who've attempted the STAR challenge, we've got several types of lexical sets within the poem, and I'm sure you can find more than the ones that I've found, but I've seen lexical sets for weather, for military and war, for boredom, and for sadness. Okay, that analysis was quite in-depth, and you will not be expected to produce the same amount of detail in your exam. However, it's good to pull apart a poem as much as we did so that you've got a really clear understanding of the themes of the poem and the purpose of the author. Right, now time to everyone's favourite part. We're going to do some piece paragraphs. Your question here is, how does Wilfred Owen demonstrate the realities of war in Exposure? Obviously, within your exam, you would be comparing this to another poem within the Power and Conflict cluster. So if you are able to do that, that is part of the STAR challenge. Please do give that a go. Otherwise, just write 1 or 2 piece paragraphs on the parts of the poem that we've read today. Okay, so you've been given the sentence starters there for P's. Obviously, you can mix this up and some of you will know some other ones to use. Where possible, try to embed your quotations for those higher grades. Give more than one exploration if you can. So to, again, really pull apart your quotations as much as possible. And with your zoom out, really try to consider Owen's purpose in writing the poem. So think about the reality of World War One, think about how it was portrayed to people back at home, and truly what his ideas were. Once you have finished, make sure you send your writing to your English teachers so that you can get some feedback. Finally, for your review, for some of you, this will probably be a bit of a repeat of your zoom out, but can you sum up Owen's purpose in writing this poem in 3 sentences? Please use the word because to elaborate on your answers.